My name is Emily Hartwell, and I am 40 years old. For most of my life, my stepdad loved telling anyone who would listen that I would never own anything. According to him, I was the family's quiet disappointment, the one who would spend her whole life paying someone else's mortgage while real adults built real wealth. He said it at dinner tables, at family gatherings, and sometimes just casually, the way people mention the weather, like it was simply a fact about the world that everyone already understood. What he never knew was that while he was laughing at me across those dinner tables, I was quietly doing something else entirely. I was studying, saving, learning everything there was to know about property investment, one late night at a time. And 2 years before the day that changed everything between us, I bought my first apartment building on Maple Street. He found out the way I never planned, by trying to rent a unit inside it. And I was the landlord sitting behind the desk when he walked through the door. Rick Donovan had been my stepfather since I was 14 years old, and in all the years between then and now, he never once changed his opinion of me. He was a loud man in the particular way of people who have decided that volume is the same thing as authority. He laughed easily and often, especially at things that weren't funny to the person they were about. He had spent 30 years in construction, which he referenced constantly, as though surviving in a physical industry gave him the right to judge everyone who had chosen a different path. When I was 16, he told me college was a waste of money for people who didn't have a plan. When I was 25, he stood at the Thanksgiving table and told 12 members of my extended family that I had never quite found my footing in the real world. When my marriage ended and I moved back home temporarily, he waited exactly 4 days before making his views known. He said it while I was eating breakfast and he was standing by the kitchen counter with his coffee, not even looking at me when he said it. Some people just rent their whole lives. Nothing wrong with knowing which kind of person you are. I didn't argue. I finished my breakfast, washed my bowl, and went to my room. I had learned very early that arguing with Rick changed nothing. He didn't update his opinions based on evidence or conversation. He updated them, if at all, only when reality made it impossible to hold them any longer. I decided a long time ago to let reality do the work. The morning it all came together started like an ordinary Saturday. I was in the leasing office at the Maple Street building by 1:30, going through tenant renewal paperwork at my desk. The building had 12 units. 10 were occupied by long-term tenants I had carefully selected. One had just become available after a planned move-out. And one prospective tenant had a 2 o'clock tour booked through the online portal. The name on the booking was Rick Donovan. I had stared at that name on my screen for a full minute the evening before when I first saw it come through. Then I checked the phone number attached to the booking against the number saved in my contacts. It matched. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I confirmed the appointment, put on my professional clothes the next morning, clipped my name badge to my jacket, and drove to Maple Street. I was calm by the time I got there. Whatever was about to happen, I had not arranged it and I had not chased it. Rick had found the listing himself. He had booked the tour himself. All I had done was show up to do my job, which was exactly what I had always done. Rick came through the lobby door at 2:13, already talking. He was on his phone, laughing at something on the other end of the call, looking around the lobby with the approving expression of a man who had decided in advance that he deserved nice things. He was wearing a collared shirt I hadn't seen before and carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone who expects to make a good impression. He ended his call, turned toward the leasing desk, and looked at me. The recognition took about 3 seconds. His eyebrows came together first, then his head tilted slightly, and then the familiar grin broke across his face. "Well," he said. "Emily." He shook his head as though he found the whole thing amusing. "So this is where you landed. Working the front desk." He looked around the lobby again, nodding slowly in the way of someone giving a generous review. "Good building, though. Whoever owns this place knows what they're doing." I smiled at him from behind the desk. "I'm glad you like it," I said. "Let me show you the unit." I picked up the keys from the hook behind me and walked around the desk toward the elevator. Rick followed, still nodding, still smiling, still completely certain of exactly what kind of situation he was in. The unit was on the 3rd floor, a 2-bedroom with good natural light and a balcony that faced south over the street below. Rick walked through it the way he walked through everything, like a man taking inventory of something he was already planning to own. He tested the kitchen tap. He opened and closed the bedroom closet. He pressed his palm flat against the wall near the window to check for cold drafts, the way he had taught himself to do during his construction years and never stopped doing no matter the setting. When he pushed open the balcony door and stepped outside, he let out a low whistle. "Now this," he said, "is worth paying for." He turned back to me with his hands in his pockets, relaxed and comfortable. "You should pay attention, Emily. Watch how a place like this runs. The owner built something real here. That's what adults do. They build things, they own things. They don't spend their whole lives managing other people's properties." He said it without any visible awareness of how it landed. I held the folder against my chest and looked at him. "Would you like to start the application?" I asked. Rick grinned. "Absolutely. Let's get it done." Back at the leasing desk, Rick filled out the application the way he did most things, quickly, confidently, talking the whole time. He told me his credit was excellent. He mentioned his 30 years in construction 3 separate times. He said the name of his company as though I should recognize it. He described himself as a serious, reliable tenant who paid early and maintained his space better than most people maintain spaces they actually owned. When he finished, he slid the paperwork across the desk toward me with a satisfied look. "Give that to your boss," he said. "Tell them Rick Donovan is serious about this unit." I took the application and set it beside my keyboard. "I'll review it personally," I said. Rick laughed. "Sure you will." He meant it as a joke. The idea that I had any real authority in that building had not crossed his mind as a genuine possibility. I smiled and told him he would hear back by end of day. After he left, I opened the credit reporting system, entered his details, and waited for the results to load. When they came through, I read them slowly from top to bottom. What I saw was not what Rick had described at all. The credit report told a story that Rick had clearly been keeping very private. There were late payments on 2 business loans going back 18 months. 3 credit card accounts were either at their limit or over it. There was a tax lien from the previous year that had not been resolved. And his overall score sat well below the minimum threshold that I applied consistently to every single application that came through my building, without exception. I sat with the report open on my screen and thought carefully. The minimum credit score requirement was not something I had invented to cause Rick trouble. It was a standard I had set before I accepted my very first tenant, based on research into what actually predicted reliable rental behavior. I had applied it to every applicant who had ever sat across from me, including people I liked, including people whose situations genuinely made me want to make an exception. I had never made an exception. Not once. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was my mother's number. I answered. Her voice was quieter than usual, careful in the way it got when she was telling me something she had been holding for a while. She said Rick's construction business was in serious trouble. She said she had found documents in the study. She said she was worried they might lose the house. I thanked her for telling me and said I would call her later. Then I sat quietly for a moment, looking at the credit report on my screen. Rick had spent years telling me I would never build anything. All that time, his own foundation had been quietly cracking underneath him. Dinner at my mother's house that evening was set for 7. I arrived on time and found the table already laid, the food already warm, and Rick at the head of the table in his usual chair with the look of a man who had decided that the afternoon's apartment tour had gone very well. He waited until everyone had sat down before he brought it up. "Found the perfect apartment today," he announced, looking at the table in general and then settling his gaze directly on me. "Emily showed me around. She's finally got herself a real job." There was polite laughter from my aunt and her husband, who were visiting for the weekend and had no context for any of it. Rick kept going. He described the unit in detail, the light, the balcony, the quality of the building. He said the owner clearly understood what they were doing. He said it was the kind of investment that serious people made. Then his phone, which was face up beside his plate, lit up with an email notification. He glanced at it. Then he picked it up and read the screen properly. His face changed. The color shifted first, then the jaw tightened. Then the easy confidence that had been sitting on him all evening simply left, the way air leaves a room when a window is opened suddenly. Rick's hand came down on the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. "Unbelievable," he said. My mother startled in her chair. He turned the phone toward the table so everyone could see the screen. It was the automated application decision email from the Maple Street building management system. The subject line read, Application Update, Maple Street Apartments. The decision was a decline. Rick looked at me with an expression that had moved quickly past surprise and landed somewhere between anger and certainty. You need to talk to your boss, he said. Get this reversed. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. My boss, I said. Yes. His voice had the tight, clipped quality it got when he was working to keep his temper level. Whoever owns that building. Call them tonight. Explain the situation. I set the glass down. That would be me, Rick, I said. The table went completely still. Rick stared at me for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not the warm kind, the short, dismissive kind that he had always used when something I said struck him as too far outside reality to take seriously. Good one, he said. But I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I reached into the bag beside my chair and took out my phone, opened the folder I had prepared that afternoon, and slid it across the table toward him. Inside was the LLC registration document, the property purchase agreement, and a one-page summary of the building's ownership structure with my name listed clearly as managing partner. Rick picked up the first page and read it. He put it down and picked up the second. By the third page, the laugh was completely gone. He looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not in 26 years of knowing him. It wasn't anger yet. It was something that came before anger, something raw and harder to manage. It was the expression of a man realizing that the story he had been telling himself about someone was entirely wrong. He recovered quickly. That was one thing about Rick. He had never been good at staying off balance for long. He pushed the documents back across the table and straightened in his chair and said that I had rejected him on purpose, that the decision had nothing to do with credit standards and everything to do with our history, and that what I had done was petty and small and exactly the kind of thing he should have expected. My mother looked between us with the expression she always got in the middle of these moments, like a person standing between two open fires, trying to determine which direction was safer. I slid a single printed page across the table. It was the credit policy document that I gave to every applicant before they toured a unit. It listed the minimum credit score, the income verification requirements, and the debt-to-income ratio standard. At the bottom it said that these standards were applied consistently to all applicants without exception. Rick looked at the page. He looked at the documents still spread across the table. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in my memory, Rick Donovan sat at a dinner table and had nothing to say. He came to the leasing office the next morning. I heard the door before I saw him. It opened faster than tenants usually pushed it, with the energy of someone who had spent the night building back up to a position they felt confident in. Rick stood in front of the desk with his arms crossed and his jaw set. You can override the decision, he said. You own the building. You make the rules. I looked at him calmly. The policy exists because it protects both me and my tenants, I said. If I override it for personal reasons, I create liability for myself, and I undermine the standard I've held every other applicant to. I won't do that. He leaned forward on the desk. You owe me, he said. The words landed in the room like something solid. I looked at him steadily. I don't owe you anything, Rick. He straightened up. Something shifted behind his eyes. Something that had been held up by pressure, finally losing its support. And then he muttered it, almost to himself, like a thought that had slipped out before he could catch it. If I don't get approved somewhere soon, the bank's going to take the house. He seemed to realize immediately that he had said it. He pressed his lips together and looked away. But the words were already in the room. I didn't ask him to explain. He wouldn't have, and I already knew enough from what my mother had told me the evening before. What I hadn't fully understood until that moment was how long Rick had been hiding it. The business loans, the debt, the tax lien, these weren't things that happened overnight. They had been building for at least 2 years, quietly and out of sight, while Rick continued to sit at family dinners and talk about real adults and real wealth, and the kind of people who build things versus the kind of people who spend their lives renting. All that time, he had been the one barely holding on. I thought about the Thanksgiving table when I was 25. I thought about the morning he said some people just rent their whole lives, standing in my mother's kitchen with his coffee while I sat 3 feet away eating cereal. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to assume I did. But what I actually felt, sitting in my leasing office after Rick walked out, was something quieter and more complicated than triumph. I felt tired. And underneath the tiredness, something that was almost like grief for the years that had been spent the wrong way by both of us. My mother called me that night. Her voice was steady in the way it got when she was trying very hard not to cry, holding herself together through the specific effort of someone who has had a lot of practice at it. She said the bank had filed the formal foreclosure paperwork that afternoon. She said Rick had been hoping things would turn around before it got that far and had not told her how serious it was until the documents arrived. I listened without interrupting. She didn't ask me to fix it. She wasn't calling to put pressure on me or to advocate for Rick. She was just calling because she needed to tell someone, and I was the person she trusted most. When she finished, I told her I was sorry she was going through it. I told her she could call me anytime. I told her I loved her. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in my apartment, looking at the city through the window. There was a decision forming in my mind. Not a complicated one, but an important one. About what kind of person I wanted to be in this situation. About what the right thing to do actually looked like when the person in trouble was someone who had spent years making your life smaller. I already knew the answer. I had known it before she called. Rick came back to the office 2 days later. He did not come in the way he had the morning before, fast and loud and armed with arguments. He came in slowly, with the door opening quietly behind him, and he stood in front of the desk without crossing his arms or leaning forward or doing any of the physical things he usually did when he was preparing to make a point. He just stood there. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, which I knew wasn't literally true, but exhaustion does something to a person's face that is hard to separate from age. "Emily," he said. Just my name. Nothing attached to it. I waited. "Please," he said. "Just approve the apartment. I need somewhere to go when the house is gone." There was no performance in it. No angle being worked. Just a man who had run out of other options and was asking the person he had spent years underestimating to help him. I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached for a folder on the far side of my desk. I slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward him. "There's a building about 2 miles from here," I said. "Owned by a manager I've known for years. They operate with a different credit threshold. They look at the full picture instead of just the score. Stable income history, references, that kind of thing." Rick looked at the paper. It had the address, the manager's name, and a phone number. "I already called ahead," I said. "She knows your situation in general terms. She said to have you call by Thursday." Rick stared at the page without picking it up. "You're sending me somewhere else," he said. "I'm connecting you with someone who can actually help you," I said. "I can't override my own policy without compromising the standard I've held for every tenant in this building. But I can make sure you have a real option." He was quiet for a long time. I think he had come in expecting 2 things. Either I would relent and approve him, or I would turn him away completely. He had not prepared for a third thing. He had not prepared for me to simply try to help him. Word spread through the family the way it always does. Not through any single announcement, but through the accumulation of small conversations, each one adding a piece until everyone had assembled the full picture on their own. My aunt called me on a Wednesday evening, which she had never done before. She asked carefully, in the tentative way of someone approaching a topic they aren't sure they have the right to ask about, whether it was true that I owned the building on Maple Street. I told her it was. She was quiet for a moment. "The whole building," she said. "All 12 units," I said. Another silence. "Emily," she said finally, "why didn't you ever tell anyone?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I was building it," I said. "Not performing it." She didn't fully understand what I meant, I think. But she said she was proud of me, and the way she said it carefully, like she was aware she should have said it before now, told me that she had also done some private recalculation of her own. The foreclosure notice on Rick's house appeared in the county records 3 weeks after our last conversation in the leasing office. I saw it through the property database I used for market research, the same database I checked every week as part of managing my own investments. Rick's address came up in the new listings the way any other property did, with the bank's name listed as the initiating party and the timeline for the proceedings printed in the standard legal format. I looked at the listing for a moment. Then I moved on to the next one. I didn't call anyone. I didn't mention it at the next family dinner, which happened to fall that same weekend. I sat at the table and talked about ordinary things and let the situation be what it was. Rick wasn't there. My mother said he had a prior commitment, which I understood was not entirely true, but I didn't push it. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood by everyone in the room. The moving truck appeared outside Rick's house on a Thursday morning in early autumn. My mother had warned me it was coming, so I wasn't surprised. But she called me again that morning while the truck was being loaded, and her voice had the particular quality of someone watching something end that they had not fully prepared themselves for, even though they had known for months that it was coming. I talked to her for 40 minutes while she sat in the kitchen and watched through the window. I didn't try to reframe it or wrap it in perspective, or tell her what it all meant. I just stayed on the line and listened when she talked and said the small things that people say when there is nothing large enough to say. Rick had called the manager I referred him to. He had been approved for a unit in the building 2 miles away. It was smaller than what he had wanted, and in a neighborhood that was quieter and less impressive than the one he was leaving. But it was available, it was clean, and the terms were fair. I had made sure of that before I passed along the number. Whatever Rick had been to me, my mother loved him, and she was my mother. That was enough of a reason. I ran into Rick outside a grocery store on a Saturday morning in November. He was coming out as I was going in. He had a single bag in each hand and was wearing a jacket I recognized from years back, an older one he had stopped wearing when the business was doing well and he had bought himself newer things. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. We both stopped. There was a long beat where neither of us said anything, just two people standing on a footpath on a cold morning, carrying the full weight of a shared history and not quite sure which part of it to pick up first. Rick set one of the bags down at his feet. He looked at me with an expression that was not comfortable for him to be wearing. I could see that clearly. It was the expression of a man who had spent most of his life being the loudest person in the room and was now standing quietly on a footpath with nothing left to be loud about. "You really own that building," he said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man finally saying out loud something he had been slowly accepting for weeks. "I do," I said. He nodded once. He looked at the pavement. We stood there for another moment. The street moved around us, a woman with a stroller, 2 teenagers on bikes, a delivery van pulling slowly into a loading bay across the road. Ordinary Saturday morning things that had nothing to do with us and paid us no attention at all. Rick picked his bag back up. He looked at me one more time, and this time the expression was different. Not comfortable. Still, I don't think comfortable was something Rick knew how to look when the situation called for it. But honest, in the way that exhausted people sometimes arrive at honesty because they no longer have the energy for anything else. "I was wrong about you," he said. His voice was flat and quiet and not decorated with anything extra. No apology attached, no explanation offered, no request following behind it. Just the statement itself, delivered the way facts are delivered when there is no longer any point in arguing with them. It was the most straightforward thing I had ever heard him say. I looked at him for a moment. "I know," I said. And then I walked into the grocery store, and he walked to his car, and that was the end of it. The week after the grocery store, I signed the purchase agreement for my second building. It was larger than the Maple Street property, 16 units in a neighborhood I had been watching for 3 years, waiting for the right moment and the right price. The moment had come in September, and the price had been negotiated over 6 weeks, and by the time I signed my name on the final page, everything I had spent 15 years learning had gone into making that single decision correctly. The bank manager who processed the paperwork shook my hand across the desk and said, "Congratulations, Ms. Hartwell. This is a strong acquisition." I thanked him, gathered my copies, and walked out to my car in the afternoon light. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before starting the engine. Not celebrating exactly. More like absorbing. Letting the reality of it settle properly before the momentum of the next thing took over. 2 buildings now. From nothing. From a rented desk in a shared office and 15 years of early mornings and careful decisions and the very specific kind of patience that comes from deciding to let your work speak instead of your words. The first application for a unit in the new building came in the following Tuesday. I opened it on my laptop at the leasing desk on Maple Street, the same desk where I had sat across from Rick 8 weeks earlier and watched his confidence rearrange itself into something he did not recognize. The applicant was a woman in her early 30s. Clean credit history. Stable employment. 2 strong references from previous landlords. A short personal note at the bottom of the application that said she had been saving for 2 years to afford a building in this neighborhood and hoped I would give her application serious consideration. I read the note twice. Then I approved the application and sent the confirmation email. There was nothing poetic or symbolic about it, really. It was just a qualified applicant in a building I owned, getting a fair review and a fair outcome. But I sat with it for a moment anyway. Because I remembered being the woman in her early 30s who was saving and hoping and working towards something that the people around her were convinced was beyond her reach. And I knew exactly what it meant to have someone simply look at what you had actually built and say yes. On the evening after I processed that first application for the new building, I drove to Maple Street and took the elevator to the top floor. There was a maintenance walkway on the roof that I had used a few times since buying the building. Nothing dramatic, just a flat section behind the elevator housing where you could stand and see the city properly. I had gone up there the night I first got the keys alone at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday. I had stood there for a long time looking at the lights and not saying anything because there was no one to say anything to. I went back up on this particular evening for no reason I could have explained clearly if someone had asked. I stood at the railing and looked out at the skyline in the early dark. The lights were coming on across the city in the gradual way they do in autumn, building by building and street by street. Rick had stood on the balcony of the third-floor unit and whistled at this same view. He had called it something worth paying for. He had told me I should learn something from the owner. I had listened to that and said nothing. Now I was standing on the roof of the building he had been trying to rent, looking at the same city he had looked at, with my name on every document in the management office 3 floors below. I stayed up there for a while. Then I went home. Rick once believed that success was something you announced. He believed it was in the size of the house and the quality of the car and the confidence with which you sat at the head of a dinner table and told everyone around you exactly where they stood. He believed you measured a person's worth by what they had accumulated and how loudly they were willing to talk about it. I learned something different over 15 years of building quietly while people like Rick weren't paying attention. Real success doesn't need an audience. It grows in the early mornings before anyone is watching and the late evenings after everyone has stopped. It grows in spreadsheets and property reports and careful decisions made without applause. It grows in the patience of waiting for the right moment and the discipline of not touching what you have built before it is ready. Rick spent years telling me I would never own anything. I spent those same years buying a building. He eventually stood in my lobby asking for the keys. And I helped him find somewhere else to land. Not because he deserved my kindness, but because I had learned a long time ago that who I am in difficult moments matters more than what any difficult moment deserves. The people who laugh the loudest at where you are right now sometimes end up as the clearest proof of where your quiet work was always taking you. You don't have to say a word. Just keep building.